I learned long ago that states rarely announce the erosion of democratic norms directly. Instead, they narrate necessity. By the time Venezuela's government moved to establish a new agency charged with protecting what it defined as strategic areas of the economy, the country had already endured more than a decade of cumulative crisis. Oil production, once the backbone of national revenue and state legitimacy, had fallen precipitously due to mismanagement, underinvestment, and global market shifts. Hyperinflation had dismantled wages and savings. Sanctions and diplomatic isolation narrowed the country's economic oxygen. The result was not a single breaking point, but a prolonged state of emergency that blurred the line between governance and survival. It was within this atmosphere that Venezuelan leaders announced a centralized body responsible for safeguarding food systems, industrial production, and communal economic networks. The language was unmistakably martial. Strategic sectors were no longer framed as areas of public policy to be debated, regulated, and reformed, but as assets to be defended against threat and sabotage. The state cast itself as a command center under siege, responding to both external pressure and internal fragility with consolidation rather than decentralization. What strikes me is how familiar this move feels when democracies are under strain. Crisis becomes the organizing principle of power. Institutions designed for transparency and civilian oversight are supplemented or quietly displaced by bodies that operate through urgency and exceptional authority. In Venezuela's case, the creation of this agency was justified as a defensive response to disruptions in supply chains, perceived foreign hostility, and the vulnerability of essential economic infrastructure. But once strategic sectors are defined as matters of national security, they are lifted out of the realm of democratic accountability and placed into the domain of command. This is where political economy and democratic norms intersect most sharply. When economic collapse persists long enough, emergency logic hardens into institutional design. Temporary measures acquire permanence, and citizens are asked to trade participation for protection. The question that lingers for me is not whether Venezuela faces real pressures. It does. But what happens to democratic governance when crisis is no longer episodic, but structural? When command replaces consent as the organizing principle of economic life, the damage is not always immediate, but it is enduring. When governments create new institutions during moments of stress, the most revealing details are not found in the rhetoric, but in the structure. Venezuela's newly established high command to protect strategic areas was presented as an administrative response to the crisis, but its design tells a deeper story about how power is being reorganized. This was not a regulatory agency built to coordinate policy across ministries or to strengthen civilian oversight. It was a centralized command body positioned above existing economic institutions, tasked with overseeing production, distribution, and protection of what the state defined as essential sectors. The mandate was deliberately broad. Food production, industrial capacity, and communal economic networks were folded into a single strategic category, collapsing distinctions that in healthier systems are separated to preserve accountability. By placing these sectors under a unified command, the government effectively reframed economic management as a matter of security rather than public administration. Decisions that would normally be subject to legislative scrutiny, independent audits, or public debate were instead routed through an executive structure optimized for speed, discretion, and loyalty. What matters here is not just what the agency does, but how it fits into Venezuela's institutional ecosystem. Over years of emergency governance, traditional checks, parliamentary authority, judicial independence, autonomous regulatory bodies had already been weakened. The creation of this high command did not reverse that trajectory. It formalized it. Power that once flowed through civilian ministries was consolidated upward, justified by the claim that extraordinary threats required extraordinary coordination. I've seen versions of this logic before in democracies that convince themselves that institutional shortcuts are temporary. But structure has memory. Once authority is centralized, it rarely disperses on its own. In Venezuela's case, the high command did not replace existing institutions outright. It overlaid them, creating ambiguity about who ultimately governs economic life. That ambiguity is not accidental. It allows responsibility to diffuse upward while accountability evaporates downward. This is how democratic erosion often advances, not through the abolition of institutions, but through their subordination. The architecture remains, but the center of gravity shifts. And when economic survival is framed as a battlefield, command becomes the organizing principle. What is lost in that shift is not efficiency, but democratic agency itself. By the time Venezuela's leadership began speaking of the economy as something that needed to be defended rather than rebuilt, the collapse was already systemic. Years of contraction had hollowed out the productive base. Oil output, once measured in millions of barrels per day, had fallen to levels unseen in generations. Manufacturing capacity had withered. Agriculture struggled under shortages of inputs, capital, and labor. What remained of the productive apparatus functioned less as an engine of growth than as a fragile network kept alive through improvisation and state intervention. It is in this context that the new High Command's mission takes on its full meaning. To protect the economy was not to liberalize it, diversify it, or restore institutional confidence. It was to secure what still existed against disruption, hoarding, flight, and perceived sabotage. Economic management was reimagined as a defensive operation, concerned less with expansion than with containment. Supply chains were treated as vulnerable infrastructure. Production sites became strategic assets. Distribution itself was framed as a terrain of conflict. This framing has consequences. When an economy is governed through the logic of defense, scarcity is no longer a policy failure, but a condition to be managed. Shortages become evidence of a threat rather than misallocation. Centralization is justified not as an ideological choice, but as a practical necessity. And citizens are repositioned not as economic participants, but as dependents within a protected system whose rules they did not shape. I have watched how this logic takes hold in systems under prolonged stress. It narrows the range of acceptable debate. It elevates loyalty over competence. And it transforms economic policy into an extension of political survival. In Venezuela, the language of protecting the productive apparatus blurred the distinction between stabilizing livelihoods and preserving regime control. The same mechanisms used to ensure food distribution could also be used to reward compliance and punish dissent. This is the quiet danger of an economy placed on a permanent war footing. Defense may prevent immediate collapse, but it also freezes the system in place. Innovation recedes, trust erodes, and the promise of shared prosperity is replaced by the expectation of managed survival. When economic life is organized around protection rather than participation, democracy is not merely strained, it is structurally sidelined. It is impossible to separate Venezuela's economic emergency from its internal political landscape because the two have been mutually reinforcing for years. As the state's capacity to deliver prosperity diminished, its reliance on control intensified. The establishment of a high command to protect strategic areas did not emerge in a political vacuum. It arrived in a system already reshaped by contested elections, weakened opposition institutions, and a steady concentration of executive authority. What the new body offered was not just economic coordination, but political insulation. Power consolidation in Venezuela has followed a familiar pattern. Formal institutions remain in place, but their independence has been eroded through parallel structures that answer directly to the executive. The High Command fits squarely within this logic. By positioning itself above ministries, regional authorities, and local governance mechanisms, it reduced the space in which alternative centers of influence could operate. Economic decision-making became less plural, less transparent, and more tightly bound to political loyalty. This mattered most at the local level, where scarcity intersects with power. Control over food distribution, industrial inputs, and communal production networks became tools not just of policy, but of political management. In a system where survival is uncertain, access becomes leverage. The line between social protection and political conditionality grows thin. The High Command's authority over strategic sectors allowed the government to mediate that access, reinforcing dependency while weakening the capacity for organized dissent. I've seen how democracies begin to lose their footing when political competition is reframed as instability and opposition is recast as risk. In Venezuela, institutional restructuring was justified as necessary to preserve order and continuity. But continuity of what and for whom? The concentration of power around economic survival narrowed the definition of legitimacy itself. Governance became less about representation and more about endurance. This is how democratic erosion advances without dramatic rupture. Elections still occur, laws are still passed, but the balance of power shifts decisively toward those who control resources in a time of shortage. The High Command did not merely respond to crisis, it embedded crisis into the architecture of rule. And when political survival is tethered to economic command, the cost is paid in diminished pluralism and a shrinking democratic horizon. No account of Venezuela's institutional transformation is complete without reckoning with the external pressures that have shaped it. For years, the country has existed under an increasingly constricted international environment, defined by sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and adversarial relationships with major economic and military powers. These pressures did not create Venezuela's internal failures, but they profoundly altered the incentives under which the state operates. They offered the government both a real constraint and a powerful narrative. Sanctions targeting the oil sector, financial transactions, and state institutions reduced access to capital, technology, and export markets. The impact was cumulative, constricting the state's ability to generate revenue and import essential goods. In response, Venezuelan leaders framed economic survival as a matter of national defense. Strategic sectors were portrayed as frontline assets in a geopolitical struggle, vulnerable not just to market forces, but to deliberate external coercion. This framing matters because it relocates responsibility. Economic decline becomes evidence of foreign aggression rather than domestic policy failure. Institutional centralization becomes an act of resistance rather than a consolidation of power. The creation of a high command to protect strategic areas was thus positioned not merely as internal governance, but as a sovereign response to international hostility. In this narrative, democratic constraints are luxuries a besieged nation cannot afford. I've watched how geopolitical pressure can harden political systems, even those already weakened from within. When leaders define the state as under siege, dissent can be recast as collaboration and scrutiny as sabotage. The international arena becomes a mirror in which domestic authority is reinforced. Every sanction, every diplomatic rupture becomes justification for further centralization. Yet the paradox is unavoidable. External pressure may strengthen the government's grip in the short term, but it also deepens the structural isolation that erodes long-term economic recovery and institutional legitimacy. The High Command operates within this tension, claiming to shield the nation while presiding over an economy increasingly disconnected from global systems of trust and exchange. Geopolitics, in this sense, does not merely surround Venezuela's crisis, it penetrates it. The lines between foreign policy, economic management, and domestic control blur. And when survival on the world stage becomes the organizing logic of governance at home, democracy is not only constrained by pressure from outside, but reshaped by how that pressure is politically consumed within. Power does not sustain itself through institutions alone. It relies on narrative. In Venezuela, as the state reorganized economic governance around protection and command, the media environment became a critical terrain in which legitimacy was constructed and defended. The creation of a high command to protect strategic areas was accompanied by a carefully calibrated story. One of sovereignty under threat, resilience under siege, and leadership acting decisively in the face of extraordinary danger. State-aligned media amplified this framing, presenting the agency as a stabilizing force, safeguarding the population from chaos and foreign interference. Scarcity was explained as the result of sabotage or external coercion. Centralization was portrayed as efficiency. In this narrative, criticism was not an exercise of democratic accountability, but a weakening of national unity. The language was designed not to persuade skeptics, but to narrow the space in which alternative explanations could circulate. At the same time, independent journalism operated under growing constraint. Legal pressure, economic precarity, and restricted access to information limited the ability of reporters to interrogate official claims. When institutions centralize power, they also centralize information. The High Command's authority over strategic sectors made transparency discretionary rather than structural. Data about production, distribution, and decision-making became harder to verify, allowing narrative to outrun evidence. I've seen how this dynamic unfolds elsewhere. When truth becomes a function of loyalty, legitimacy is no longer earned through performance, but enforced through repetition. Citizens are not asked to evaluate outcomes, but to accept framing. The media ecosystem shifts from watchdog to amplifier, not always by decree, but through attrition and fear. What emerges is a form of legitimacy that is brittle, but durable enough to endure a crisis. It does not require broad consent, only sufficient compliance. The high command's existence is normalized through constant invocation of threat until emergency governance feels ordinary. And when narrative fills the gaps left by institutional collapse, democracy suffers a quieter loss. The erosion of a shared factual foundation on which accountability depends. When an emergency becomes structural, its consequences are not always immediately visible. Venezuela's creation of a high command to protect strategic areas may succeed in preventing sudden collapse in specific sectors, but it does so by locking the country into a model of governance built on the permanence of crisis. The longer economic life is organized around protection rather than participation, the harder it becomes to imagine recovery that is democratic, transparent, and broadly shared. The institutional legacy of this approach is already taking shape. Centralized command over production and distribution weakens incentives for innovation and investment. Ambiguity over authority discourages private and communal initiative alike. Over time, economic actors adapt, not by improving productivity, but by navigating proximity to power. Survival replaces growth as the organizing goal. In that environment, corruption is not an aberration. It is a rational response to uncertainty. Politically, the cost is subtler but deeper. When legitimacy is maintained through control of resources and narrative rather than through consent, democratic accountability atrophies. Citizens may comply, but they are no longer participants in shaping economic or political outcomes. Institutions remain standing, but hollowed out. Elections persist, but their capacity to alter policy diminishes when core economic decisions are insulated from public influence. The road ahead for Venezuela is constrained not only by sanctions or geopolitical rivalry, but by the institutional choices made under pressure. Reversing centralization is far more difficult than imposing it. Emergency bodies, once normalized, resist dissolution. And the longer crisis governance endures, the more it reshapes political culture, teaching both leaders and citizens to expect command instead of deliberation. I do not pretend that Venezuela's challenges have simple solutions, but history suggests that economies do not recover sustainably without trust, and democracies do not survive without accountability. Protecting strategic areas may preserve fragments of the productive apparatus, but it cannot substitute for institutional legitimacy. The true measure of recovery will not be whether the state can defend what remains, but whether it can restore a system in which power is constrained, information is credible, and economic life is governed by rules rather than emergency. Without that, the future risks becoming an extension of the present managed, controlled, and perpetually unfinished.